We're going to part 5 of the Age of Progressive Reform. Now we're going to take a look at the Progressive Presidency. One of the things that is going to prompt Roosevelt into some of his active reforms is actually a book that was published by Upton Sinclair in 1906 called The Jungle. Now, this book is kind of ironic in a lot of ways because if you've read this book, you know what it's about. It's about the plight of this Lithuanian family, right? This young man and a woman and their family arrived to Chicago from Lithuania, and the whole story is about the plight of their lives, right? And it's a tragedy if you read this book. I'll give you just one little sample from it. At one point, after he had gotten a job at Packingtown in Chicago in the meatpacking plant and had lost that job because he'd been injured and never fully recovered from it, his wife had taken a job and had become pregnant because her boss had raped her. He goes, beats up that boss and goes to jail. She ends up having premature labor where she and the child both die. I mean, this thing goes on and on and on. So, and that's just one of the many tragedies in this book. But what the public got out of this in 1906 was his description of the meatpacking industry itself, when he has that first job early in the book there in Packingtown. Because it talks about, you know, Upton Sinclair did a lot of research on this book, and he really went into a lot of detail in the conditions inside of these packing houses. Now, his intent was to show how hard it is for these immigrant workers in there. But what the public got out of that was, ew, the meatpacking industry is nasty. It's dirty. It's, oh, meat is gross, right? And so what happens is you see a lot of people clamoring for reform of the meatpacking industry as a result. Upton Sinclair himself said, he says, I aimed my book at the heart, the Americans' hearts, and I hit them in the stomach, right? And the result of this is that Roosevelt is going to form the Meat Inspection, or get past the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, right? Because, I mean, the people were begging for regulation. And honestly, the meat packing firms like Armour and Swift Company were as well, because the result of this book meant a lot of people and a lot of foreign markets were not buying American beef. They were losing their exports. And they said, look, we need you to inspect us so we can say, look, we are one of the good guys. Our factories are clean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Government has approved us. Okay. And so the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906 will help make this happen. The Meat Inspection Act required the U.S. Department of Agriculture to inspect livestock in the slaughterhouses to make sure the conditions were sanitary. And the Pure Food and Drug Act outlawed the adultering or mislabeling of any foods or drugs. And you actually have to say what's in the food and drugs, which leads you to some pretty interesting ingredient labels, especially when you take a look at things like certain cough syrups and stuff from that time period. So we got Roosevelt the trust buster, we got Roosevelt the reformer, we got Roosevelt using the executive branch to create regulation and reform. And finally, we have Roosevelt the conservationist, right? Remember, he's an avid outdoorsman, and so he's really into this idea of conservation, and he sees that there's a definite need for it. I'll give you an example. By the 1900s, the national forests in the United States had been reduced by about 80% from what it had been at the time of the nation's founding, right? We were really using up these resources quickly. So it led to naturalists like John Muir of California writing the president about this problem. In 1892, John Muir had founded the Sierra Club, and in 1903, he's going to invite President Roosevelt to come out to Yosemite in California, that's the picture you see here, to discuss environmental preservation, right? Now, Roosevelt is going to respond to this with a concerted effort towards conservation of the country's open spaces. He's going to expand the U.S. Forest Service, and he's going to designate 150 national forests. In fact, he's going to increase forest land in the United States under federal control by 200 million acres, right? He's going to create 18 national parks, including the Grand Canyon National Monument in 1908. He's going to designate 51 federal bird reservations, right? And progressives are going to follow suit with this. You're going to see this after he leaves the presidency. In 1916, for example, under Woodrow Wilson, Congress is going to pass the National Parks Act of 1916, which creates the National Park Service, right, to preserve, quote, the national parks lands and leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So you're going to see this conservationist movement as a component of the progressive movement brought on primarily by the efforts of Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt served all but 6 months of McKinley's second term, right? So effectively a full term of office. And he ran for re-election in 1904. Remember, he ran under the idea of giving the American people a square deal, right? And he won that re-election convincingly. In 1904, he won with the largest margin of victory in American history up to that point in time, right? So he's very popular, very easily could have run again in 1908, but in the 1904 election, he made a serious political blunder. He openly announced when he received the nomination that he would not seek a third term, that he would not run for re-election again, following the Washington tradition. By the time 1908 rolled around, he really regretted saying that. He would have gladly run for another term if given the opportunity, but he didn't want to go back on his word and be called a hypocrite. So instead, he handpicked his successor, a man named William Howard Taft. Now, William Howard Taft, you couldn't categorize him as progressive as Roosevelt as far as being overtly progressive, but he had some progressive attributes of his own. But William Howard Taft's eyes were not on the presidency. He really didn't have any interest in being president of the United States. What he wanted was he wanted to be the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was the son of a judge, and he was a judge himself, and that's what his aspirations were. The presidency for him was a stepping stone towards that. By the way, he eventually will become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and will see the inauguration of presidents all the way up through Herbert Hoover. Okay, so Roosevelt has appointed him as his handpicked successor. And after 4 years, as I mentioned before, Taft is going to break up more trust in 4 years than Roosevelt did his 8, but he does it like a judge, right? He does it very much in the background. He looks at the evidence. He makes the determinations. He pushes it forward. He's not in your face about it. So perception-wise, he's not seen as progressive, and therefore Roosevelt labels him as not a progressive. And he's absolutely just flabbergasted by Taft's conservatism. And again, I think this is a little bit unfair. But as a result, he decides that he's going to run for the Republican nomination in 1912. All right. Now, he loses that nomination to Taft. The Republicans really don't necessarily want, or at least the conservative Republicans don't want that progressive Roosevelt back. And so Taft wins the nomination. But Roosevelt is not going to stop there. He's going to form a party that officially is going to be called the Progressive Party, but it will be referred to as the Bull Moose Party. Okay? Now, he is going to start barnstorming across America, giving campaign speeches for his Bull Moose Party and his bid for the presidency as a progressive candidate. He's going to paint Taft as not progressive. And meanwhile, the Democrats are going to decide to take a page from the Republican playbook, and they're going to nominate a progressive of their own, a man by the name of Woodrow Wilson. Okay, so you got two progressives and the seemingly non-progressive Taft. Now, Roosevelt's going to gain a lot of attention here in this barnstorming election campaign. Matter of fact, he's even going to get the attention of some people that he probably doesn't want the attention of. People like John Schrank. Who is John Schrank? John Schrank is a part-time painter, part-time bartender, full-time lunatic. Okay? He's got a lot of issues. Matter of fact, he keeps talking about, as we find out later, he found leading up to the election, he kept having this, and he kept mentioning this recurring nightmare he kept having, where the ghost of William McKinley was floating above his bed, blaming Theodore Roosevelt for his death and saying, no third terms, right? And so John Schrank got it in his head that it was his mission, that he was being told by the dead president that he had to prevent Teddy Roosevelt from winning a third term in office. And so he begins stalking him. And he catches up with him on October 14th, 1912 at the Milwaukee Auditorium, where Roosevelt's going to make a speech, right, in this campaign effort of his. And Roosevelt, as he's walking to his car to drive to the auditorium itself, John Schrank steps out of the crowd with a handgun and he shoots the president straight in, or the former president, sorry, straight in the chest. Theodore Roosevelt is shot. And down he goes. John Schrank is quickly tackled and apprehended, right? And Roosevelt gets back up. Blood starting to soak his shirt. And they're like, Mr. Roosevelt, you've been shot. He goes, yes, I know, right? Come on, we got to get to the auditorium. I got a speech to give. Like, no, we need to go to the hospital. You've been shot. And he's like, no, after this speech, right? Now, what had happened here is the bullet had struck the speech that was in his breast pocket, a 50-page speech that he had folded in half. So this bullet literally traveled through 100 pages of speech and through his glasses case that held his Nesbitt glasses, and had lodged itself into his right lung. Okay. It was in a trajectory that would have, had it not lost all that momentum, continued on and pierced his heart and probably would have killed him. But he was saved by this humongous speech that he'd written, right? But he continues on to the auditorium to give his speech, despite the fact that he's got a bullet in his lung and a lung that is collapsed. He arrives, he pulls the speech out, and he holds it up. You can visually see the hole through the speech as he puts it down. He pulls out his glasses case and he opens it, and it's mangled, the steel case, and the glasses are destroyed, and he makes sure that everybody there sees it as he puts it down on his bully pulpit. And he takes off his jacket to reveal a blood-stained shirt in front of the shocked crowd in Milwaukee. And he announces to the crowd, he says, I don't know whether you fully understand that I've just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. And he proceeded to give a speech that lasted the next 2 hours. And then went to the hospital afterwards. Now, despite that, he still did not win the election there in 1912. Taft would get about 20% of the vote, and Woodrow Wilson and Roosevelt would split the other 80%, with Wilson getting a solid plurality and a good percentage of the Electoral College, enough to get over 50% of it. And it did signify one thing, that the progressives, unlike the populist movement, remember the populist movement, William Jennings Bryan, despite the popularity of populism, couldn't get elected. In this case, the two progressives in 1912 got 80% of the vote. That meant the people were not afraid of progressivism like they were of populism, right? But, like I said, as a result of this, Taft ends up to just move on and eventually become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And now we have the third and last of the progressive presidents, Woodrow Wilson.